You are now listening to The Unwavering, the movement dedicated to educating and empowering the brave men and women who have or are still serving our great nation. What's up, everyone? This is Kevin with another episode of The Unwavering. For those of you guys who are just tuning in for the first time, I'm an 8-year veteran of the United States Marine Corps. I served as an avionics technician, a quality assurance inspector, and a communications security advisor aboard the CH-53, VH-3, and VH-60 helicopters. Today is going to be the first time that we are taking the podcast to a global level, really trying to bridge that gap between military service members here in the States as well as other service members from around the world. So I'm super excited for that. And at this time, I'll go ahead and hand the mic over to Barry and let him introduce himself.
Thanks for the opportunity to connect with you. I'm here in Australia, in Sydney, working as a psychologist and a contract psychologist with our veteran-based counselling organisation in Australia. I've been with them for 17 years. Prior to that, in terms of my history, I was combat veteran from the Rhodesian Bush War in the 70s, and currently work both, as I said, with the veteran organisation, and I work in a school as a psychologist during the day. So have a passion for both, and over the last many years have dedicated time and service to veterans around the world, sharing the way that I work and the way I combine operational terminology to allow veterans to understand steps towards healing.
That's incredible. We're definitely excited to have you bringing not just combat experience to the table, but as you said, bringing the psychology, the educational aspect to it, and helping us better educate tomorrow's veterans and helping them cope with situations that in many instances are considered taboo. So again, just a huge honor to have you on here. We'll go ahead and get started. Can you go ahead and give us a little bit of insight as to who you are and your time in the service?
So 1972 to 1975, I was at university. So unlike most of my generation in Rhodesia who were called up at the age of 18, I went to university for 4 years, then got called up, went back to begin my service. I did the basic training and then entered the officer training program, which was not a good idea, as I often say, because I had zero sense of direction. On the third day of training, came off a obstacle course. I had a dislocated shoulder from an old gymnastics injury, then trained as a combat medic, went to my unit, which was on the border of Rhodesia and Mozambique, joined my stick of 3 men. So we'd have, stick leader, machine gunner, and I carried the full medical pack. And off we went into the bush for 7 months with brief moments of R&R. In terms of what I did as a combat medic, we were trained to do everything from cut downs, drips, drugs, fairly advanced stuff to save lives, after which choppers would come in and pick them up and take them away, and then we'd carry on our patrol. I meandered from there all over the world, to cut it short. I was in Australia, I was in England, where I did some training in second languages and was part of a group selected to begin the British Council English Language Centre. Did that for 4 years. At that point, I meandered back to South Africa, where I began running marathons and ultra marathons, and then eventually ended up in Australia, back in Australia in the year 2000, and I've been here ever since. So that's a whirlwind tour.
When we speak about your military experience, I'm just curious, your combat tours were within Africa, right?
Correct, yeah.
Is that normal for South African forces? I'm just curious. Or do you guys also work with United Nations and deploy to various locations?
Okay. So if South Africa is at the bottom of Africa, just on the top of South Africa is a little country which was called Rhodesia, which is called Zimbabwe now. Most people would know it as Zimbabwe. So I was first generation. My father was a Romanian. He eventually found his way to Rhodesia. And at that time was Southern Rhodesia, which was a British colony. We declared independence and became Rhodesia. So I was in the Rhodesian military, which was a very small military organization, but certainly carried enough clout for its protocols to spread around the world. We didn't have anything to do with any other countries. The incursions were all within the border. And so our war, as they call it, the Bush War, was literally because we were fighting in various terrains on the borders.
Okay, wow. Now that's interesting because I don't think many of us hear those stories. Obviously, you served in the Rhodesian forces, but you being in Australia for some time now, what are some of the common struggles that you see veterans from Australia facing?
Look, when I began 17 years ago with my organization, I was working with the sort of tail end of the World War IIs and primarily the Vietnam veterans. And there I was picking up at the time, which felt to be a lot like the trauma-based issues from fighting in Vietnam: high anxiety, depression, flashbacks, alcohol use, and serious impacts on being able to work within families and relationships and hold jobs. However, over the 17 years, having seen a lot of folk from Iraq, Afghanistan, I see, yes, they carry things from operations, but increasingly I'm seeing that the biggest challenge facing us today is the transitional complexity, and that men and women attempting to transition from the military into civilian life are facing huge, huge issues. I don't think that the transitional territory has been mapped out effectively and in detail, because there are layers and layers. There's subtle aspects like identity as a veteran. Through a lot of self-questioning, I began to ask the guys I was working with, how do you feel about being a veteran? How do you feel about marching in our Anzac commemorative events once a year? And I was picking up increasingly a lot of hesitation about not being good enough. And that sense of not being good enough and not having earned the right to be a veteran, I began to see was haunting people, but not spoken about. They didn't feel good enough. And the good enough was that they may have been in operations, but never had a contact. Even within the special forces, they didn't see as much action as others did, or they were in the military but were not operational. So it didn't matter where it was and how far up the line you were in terms of actual contacts or engagements. So a lot of my work now is exploring the transitional territory, while at the same time paying attention to any operational impact, loss of mates, trauma-based work, but a lot of it is on the transitional complexities.
Definitely some things that need to be discussed, and it's interesting to hear you say that because again, as we discuss this subject, there's a lot of similarities in what you're saying to what my countrymen experience here once they get out of the military.
Yeah.
And that's a huge one. The social adaptability piece
Yes.
is by far one of the most difficult ones that I see. I had a little bit of trouble when I was adapting and really trying to find my place because you're right, it's different. You get out and you don't necessarily fit in with mainstream society.
Correct.
So you're trying to understand, like, okay, am I an outcast? Can I fit in?
Yeah.
But again, that social adaptability and people thinking that they're not good enough is detrimental. And it's even worse when certain entities tell you that because you didn't serve in combat, you don't rate this benefit
Correct.
or you can't get access to this type of treatment. So that's a huge piece. And I'm glad that you brought that up because I'm sure we'll get into that here in a second. But how do you feel when it comes to multiple nations? Do you believe that regardless of where we come from, whether that's America, the UK, Australia, that we all face similar struggles when separating from the military?
Yeah, look, it doesn't matter what generation we are. You and your age, me and my time, the Vietnam veteran boys, the World War II boys, Iraq, Afghani boys currently, different movie, but we all carry an extremely similar story. And that is the story, I think, that also bonds us in what I call tribe and a brotherhood. And when I say brotherhood, I don't mean it in terms of male, female. It's a gender neutral term. We are brothers. We're brothers from the same tribe, regardless of our time at war or what kind of a war it was. In sitting with the guys, I see the huge challenges they have in adapting and adjusting to civilian life. I often describe civilian territory as the next operational zone. And it is for veterans. We think that the brain at war automatically transitions to the brain in civilian life. Well, it doesn't. The brain at war is wired, and it doesn't just go, oops, we're in civilian life and we need to adjust and adapt. It maintains the same protocols. However, the protocols in the military are ones that keep you safe. In civilian life, they are often judged. So hypervigilant, hitting the deck at sounds, distracted and overwhelmed in shopping centers, mood impacted on, struggling to find a job, communication skills, still military talk, struggling to adjust to the lack of role differentiation. A big complaint is in civilian life: loyalty, adjustability, adaptability, putting other people first before yourself. They often will say that these are values that are very thin on the ground in civilian life. So I don't know if that summarizes or answers the questions you put to me.
Yes, no, absolutely. You definitely touched on a few good things. When people do get out and let's say they do have some sort of trauma, being surrounded by groups of people that you don't know the circumstance. I've got friends that anywhere we go, they're looking at all the exits,
Yeah,
they're mapping it out in their mind because that's what they've been trained to do and
correct.
they experience something traumatic. So that's how they kind of carry their life forward. So I think you mentioning these things and that it's not a disorder in some cases, sure, it can be, but I think when we use the word disorder, it makes some people think that there's something wrong with them. And that's what we're trying to talk about. There's nothing wrong with you guys asking for help. There's nothing wrong with you guys not being okay in large crowds or you having trouble adapting to society now that you're a civilian because it's a completely different culture. And we spend tons of money educating ourselves and preparing ourselves to go to combat or to serve in the military, but we don't necessarily invest that same amount of time into teaching people how to transition and reintegrate into society. And that's a huge piece that's missing. And that's where a lot of people are really struggling.
Yeah, look, I think you're spot on 100%. And, if you think about it, whether you're watching doorways or whether you get slightly overwhelmed in complex shopping centers with noise and a lot of movement, if it's not impacting on your work, your relationships, and your well being, it's what I call functional trauma. A certain amount of vigilance is not a bad thing. And if you think about it, what is the value of veterans? They rapidly track situations, are coherent, highly resilient, and manage to deal with complex issues simultaneously in a calm way. So we need to start to look at a lot of the symptomatology that is not destructive as quite functional and get the message across that you're okay. There may be things that you may want to work on, but effectively, what I say to numbers of the guys is, you're okay. Let's just look at how we can bring down your stress and anxiety, help you to understand your transitional process, and adjust to the challenges of very alien territory.
Thank you so much for saying that. You're 100% spot on. For those of you guys who are listening, who are in that place where you are struggling to transition, you feel like an outcast, you feel like you don't fit in, there's nothing wrong with you. Sure, as Barry mentioned, maybe there's things that we have to change. Maybe we have to work on helping you be a little bit more charismatic or being more of a people person. But just because you get anxiety or there's certain situations where you're looking for escape routes, things like that. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That could be a good thing, especially in today's world. So don't think that there's anything wrong with you and continue to surround yourself by fellow veterans. I know that's for me, I don't really like therapy or things like that, but me surrounding myself with fellow veterans, regardless, as you said earlier, of the time that they served. I've talked to Vietnam veterans, I've talked to people from Afghanistan, Iraq. And yes, there's huge age differences, but we automatically have some sort of bond and it does bring down my level of stress. And I feel like a normal human being around them. So things like that are extremely helpful. But yeah, if you guys take one thing away from today, I just want you guys to know that there's nothing wrong with you. And if you need help, it's perfectly acceptable to ask for it.
Yeah, that spot on. And, I guess that's why over the years I had to think about what was the language I was using with the guys I was sitting with. And, the funny part is you talk about keeping yourself in tribe. Look what I've done. My private practice is solely with veterans. So that means every day after hours, I'm sitting with brothers in my tribe. So, of course, we know where we belong. But to get back to the language, I realized that there was a way of communicating with veterans where the work that you were inviting them to do to heal made sense. So when blokes come into my room, I will often say to them, remember when you were doing a pull through? And they go, yep. Some very few I've actually had to explain, drop a weighted lead, piece of cloth, bit of oil. And I go,
I
why
was
do
going to say, Barry, I don't mean to cut you off, but
yeah.
I do not know what that means. I
Okay.
apologize. So you'll
Okay.
have to explain it for us
All right.
over here in the US.
Yeah, okay. Pull through barrel of the weapon, drop a weighted piece down with a piece of string and an oilcloth at the bottom, put it through, and make sure the barrel of your weapon is clean. What do you call them?
Oh, cleaning the bore.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's just cleaning the bore.
We called it a pull through. And I often say to the guys, why do you do pull through? And he goes, I don't know. And I go, well, there are three reasons, right? I go, AD, accidental discharge, a stoppage, or we call it a runaway gun, where your gun, if it's an MAG or a machine gun, just starts firing randomly. And then I explain to them that the AD is uncontrollable anger suddenly in a family or an interaction, and your runaway gun is where you literally are out of control. So then I ask them, what are you doing for a pull through? And they go, well, what do you mean? I go, what's your eating like? What's your sleeping like? What's your fitness like? I start off on the obvious things. And then I have a series of exercises, body-based breathing exercises. Many of them, is the box breathing, 4-7-8 breathing. And there's a number of breathing, body-based, mindfulness-based things. We talk about whether they're willing to do things like yoga. And so when they leave my room, they understand how to go from the ambush zone, which is in the back of the brain where your claymores are. And that is what's driving you into anxiety and stress, alcohol use, hypervigilance, out of control, and how to move from your ambush zone to your OP observation post, which is the part of your brain where you can think and plan and observe in a rational and a calm way. And I explain that the ambush zone generally sends blood flow to the OP, and that's a good balance. You alert, but you can assess whether it's dangerous or not, or whether it's just a stick on the side of the road or a box on the side of the road and not a snake or an IED. But when we kick up in the ambush zone, I explain to the blokes, blood flow stops. So now you're not even able to see anything from a perspective. You are just firing up. So what we have to do is we have to crank down your ambush zone as quickly as possible to get blood flow to the OP, and then we can have a conversation. So there are things like, drinking a glass of very cold water changes blood flow in the brain. If you're cranking out of control, get into a cold shower. Many of you would have heard the Wim Hof way in America, where he uses a lot of cold showers and breathing techniques. He's climbed Everest, I think, in a pair of shorts and running shoes. So I give them things where immediately, if they start to work on these, they're back in the driver's seat. But it's all based within operational concepts and operational protocols. I talk about situational awareness, the values of who you were. So I invite the warrior to reconnect with the civilian, to call back the values and the protocols and help them to transition into change.
That's really a good way of putting it. The way that you are explaining it and breaking it down into military terminology is probably going to make a very significant impact on those you're trying to reach, because you're right. When we get out and, you see guys going to the Veteran Affairs office,
Yeah,
you can see them getting into arguments with the staff there, and it's because they don't have the same communication. Sometimes they're communicating with people who haven't been to combat, haven't experienced what they have.
correct.
So if you're able to put things into terms that veterans understand, especially when we're talking about that mental health aspect, it's going to help leaps and bounds. So it's very cool to see that you are recognizing this and implementing it into your work and what you're doing with those that you're trying to help. I did want to ask, when we speak about the neuroscience principles and the brain and body-based wisdom, what exactly does that mean?
Well, as has been said, trauma doesn't just live in memory. Trauma lives in the body. Body-based modalities are things like EMDR, which uses eye movements. It's connected to the REM cycle of the sleep when the brain processes. Breathing, yoga. There are numbers of modalities that focus on the body. So we cannot separate what's in the brain and what's in the body. They exist together, and we need to address that. So if we're just in therapy, but we're not doing, maybe it could be yoga or exercise or kinesiology or anything that works with the body, well, we're neglecting a part of what exists within us.
That's an excellent point you brought up, and it actually reminds me of the piece that I did recently with John McCaskill
Oh, yeah, I know John well.
on, yeah. So the episode that we did together, when you do talk about traumatic experiences, it's oftentimes not just a singular approach. It can be a three-pronged approach, meaning, hey, you're suffering from something that's traumatic, but counseling itself, although it's going to help, is not going to solve the issue. Maybe, medication helps a little bit more, but again, it's not going to solve the issue. So for him, he found that it's a combination of counseling, in extreme circumstances, medication, but in his daily life, he practices mindfulness and meditation. So as you mentioned, that meditation aspect or getting out and staying healthy, marathon running, different things affect people differently. But you're right. The brain and the body have to be working together, not against each other. So you can't just solve the brain portion with just therapy and prescription drugs.
No.
Maybe you do have to tie in the body piece, which is meditation, yoga, things like that. So
Yeah.
definitely glad that you mentioned that. And after speaking with John and learning a little bit more about what he does, absolutely spot on.
Yeah, and I want to say, just a plug for John. I've connected with John a lot over a period of time, and what he's doing in Veterans Path is phenomenal. And I'd really like to support his initiative as an elite warrior of bringing mindfulness to veterans. And I'd strongly recommend people to connect with what he is doing. And I don't teach anything I don't use. I've meditated for 47 years. I get up and my wife and I do yoga together. I do exercises. I do a thing called tapping, which taps on energy points around the body, bilateral crossing over movements from energy psychology. And I have a pull through ritual that I do every single morning, cold water showers, some breathing techniques that come from Wim Hof. And I do this every day of my life, and I've done it for a long, long time.
Thank you for sharing some of those principles. I'm sure that people who do connect with you after this episode will definitely benefit from those things. But before we get to how people can contact you, I want to know, are there any projects that you're currently working on to help veterans, especially in the transitional piece from military to civilian life?
The two pieces of territory, the one is that through podcasts like this, I've had contact with a number of organizations and individuals, just talking about my way of approaching healing and approaching transitioning. I wrote my first little book, then I've got a free PDF on my website which combines everything. And people can go to the website, just download that. There's videos that I'm making. It's a work in progress because my hours and my days are very long. But I wanted to produce something that was at no cost, because service shouldn't have a cost involved in it. And what I'm working on now is I've contracted with a self-publishing organization in America to start my third book, which is really going to pull together all the territories involved in transition. And the idea would be to do it in a way which is readable, it's easy, and it's practical. So that's my big mission, is to do that third book, and that I'll publish.
Well, that's awesome. And since you mentioned it, people can download some of those free PDFs.
Yeah, they can download it from my website.
Perfect. Can you go ahead and leave us with how people can contact you or perhaps download some of that free information?
Just go to www.barry, B-A-R-R-Y, Zworestine, which is all one word, Z-W-O-R-E-S for Sierra, T-I-N-E.com. They can go to the website. They can also find me on LinkedIn, and the website connects me to LinkedIn, the Facebook group. They can leave messages for me there. They can also send me messages. I'm always happy to respond. So I am available to have conversations with individuals. And again, I don't have a lot of time, but there will never be a charge for any of those contacts. I earn enough from my work with my veteran organization and my school, and the service aspect of what I do means a huge amount to me, and it gives me a lot of pleasure and enjoyment and fulfillment.
Thank you. Well, guys, again, if you are interested in some of that contact, if you guys do want to speak with Barry directly via WhatsApp, LinkedIn, you can start by going to his website, which again is Barry, B-A-R-R-Y, Zworestine, and that's ZWORESTINE.com. Please check out his website, check out some of the incredible things that he is doing. And again, it's all about bridging the gap. Barry doesn't care if you're American, he doesn't care if you're Australian, South African. He just cares about giving back and helping veterans, period. So just another great resource, another extremely helpful advocate out there who wants nothing more than to see you succeed. And that's really what we all want for you. Barry, it was an absolute pleasure. I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to talk, and I look forward to learning more about what you're doing, the different things that you're involved in.
Yeah, thank you, man. And I want to say just thank you for the opportunity. I really value this and appreciate your time.
Thanks for listening to The Unwavering. Please please rate and comment on Apple Podcasts. Give us a 5-star and a great comment, and we may just read it on a future episode. Also, follow us on social platforms like Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Be sure to check back with us next week.